The KKK and other functions, having infiltrated the system, have engaged in the fascist contracts of private sector companies, subcontracting government products for surveillance, which then is systemically laundered through that system. So, by definition, they're claiming because they are private sector functions, then they are engaged in not having the limitation of the United States government while doing direct government work, which is the same foundational theory that they used in order to create the Twitter files, which is systemic fraud, which then is compounded exponentially by their terrorist enforcement operations to acquire their hate crime advantages for the influence of the Confederacy as a subordinate terrorist category, which has systemically been allowed their racist underminings, hyper amplified by the military intelligence in order to infuse the larger objectives of the white supremacists to stabilize their racist advantages. So the systemic racism is superimposed upon all activities automatically so that those who are not engaged in the function of racism have in fact engaged in the functions of racism, and thus the racism without race mechanisms of acquiring the alternate transformations generates the systematic activities of having validated the criminal operations by the subversive frauds normalized by the procedures calculated infinitum by the superintelligence from the military calculations, which has exclusively expended exorbitant amount of tax resources in order to have amplified its counteroffensive against the American civilian population, especially when it comes to the function of undermining new political operations such as, but is not limited to, the function of those that they want to publicly slander in order to maintain a Confederate grasp as a shadow government over all political formats, and thus any political party that is allowed to exist has already been subordinated to the function and thus has already disconnected themselves from the representation of the civilians they are hired to do so for, which has undermined the capability of representation, which is why they are not actively being represented. And as time goes on, these activities compound, it exponentially becomes more and more difficult to escape the function of the velocity of sinking into the Confederate hellhole, normalizing the dismantlement of all laws into anarchy for the functional advantages of the super commune structure, generating the plantations as a form of communism transformed into national capitalism from the point of view of each corporate plantation, in its variations a specialty of services, as a nation of theft. The criminal use of the surveillance powers for warrantless surveillance has been normalized under these fraudulent arguments, hyper amplified and protected by the activities of the military industrial educational complex, which has subcontracted false experiments to have normalized the expansion, which primarily has the advantage of recruitment towards radicalization for their cult activities, which is protected information by their secrets, which then normalizes the activity of such public violence and experimentation on sexuality, such as the convincing of minors that they are trans in order to compel the normalization of acceptance of their sexuality or affirmation, which leads to the genital mutilation from the non affirmative care, which is exclusively for the purpose of reinforcing the delusion that they cast on the children that they are predatory against. And this being one of infinite examples of their degenerate threat to the general public, normalizes the activity of them as a public threat at the highest level that can be labeled according to what the public has access to on clearances. This has made it a higher Confederate interest in the plot to destroy the United States, which includes the centralizing of all education so that no education can be certified unless validated by competitor education structures, which is specifically targeting David's family to keep out the School of Hard Knocks, which they viewed as the most viable competition as an essential educational structure for the primary data for the stabilizing of the general public, which they viewed as one of the higher tier threats to their objectives in the dismantlement of all challenges to racism. Now, to this end, you have the hyperinvestment into school loans, which hyper accelerates from the federal loans the destruction of the people who get the loans and are given non-viable educations from the money that they spent with the bill derived by the money that they spent. And thus you have the hyper-amplification of these programs of radicalizing their terrorists according to these contracted positions, which is one of many dimensions on how they pay for these illegal operations to conduct the normalization of hate crimes against the civilian population, which again can, in some cases, have many of the phantom cells actively generated by the priest companies from the surveillance structure, which then would contract the higher and higher entry-level wages to the ones creating the diversity from the surveillance for the individual targeting, such as from the NSA, which then allows them to contract the company at higher and higher prices to conduct these larger and larger influxes of income towards the white supremacist threat to the United States, hyper amplified by the lack of oversight over the finances due to the dereliction of Congress in refusing to conduct sober, educated votes in order to materialize each of the legitimizing of the power of the purse, which requires David Bowles, as top-ranked general from their estimate, to have been in the position fully informed in order to engage in his faculties, in order to have provided that education without this aversion, which without him actively has, as we've discussed, the hyper investment into their disadvantage, minimizing their capability of performing adequately. And to this extent, there is no educated answer, and thus there is no legal vote, and thus they've normalized the voter fraud in the advantage of the Confederacy, seeking no remedy to Confederate spells as they are destructive to the United States, which is necessary to the plot of the dissolving, consuming parasite that is the white supremacist communism, collapsing society into the collective ooze of charismatic socialism, actively collapsing the capability of the general public to engage in the existence, and thus the targeting of a particular individual hyper amplifies their inability to socialize adequately from the deterrence actively derived by the targeters, which engage in bully variation tactics, which they've invested into by the creation of bullies in the first place. After they created targets to be defective against, they hyper amplify the investment into the Hitler's Youth, creating the bully system, which creates the diversity of the childlike behavior in their harassment campaigns, which is hyper amplified in their abuse schools, such as the ones connected to Utah, in their fake Christian church functions, which has nothing to do with Christ. And these would be the Christian nationalists often referred to as actively dangerous, as they are expressly disconnected from anything that Christ has to say, and thus the mechanism has fully devoted itself to their demoniac superiors and religious loyalties as devout fanatics. And to this extent, the abuse hyper compounds on itself exponentially into dark psychology's abuse based mind control, which then normalizes the capability of their control over the target subjects, which then allows them to have the diverse advantages from every type of hate crime for the influence of their objectives, all of which are protected by their collective agreement to lie about it under the fake secrecy claim, which generates their protection, requiring the existence of the function of the United States government to have this edition released so that the government can go back to work, which would generate immediate retaliation by these degenerate white supremacist terrorist organizations and their collaborating structure under this government established Druid religion. Betrayal of the United States by these and other fraudulent military contracts generates the position that they would actively get away with criminal schemes not directly acceptable as a thing that would be allowed to be published as its own intention from the point of view of certification of the delivery of the resources under the described definition, and thus the action of the corruption in the contractors having exponentially become its own market is actively not opposed as the system of the corruption by the felonies, actively reinforced by the banking structures, generates their fraudulent compounding illusions, which makes the fact that it is a criminal action as to be an advantage and not a disadvantage by this distortion. And thus illusion has become reality, and delusion has become normalized. And thus, in the position of revelation, that there would become a strong delusion that if the times were not shortened, even the elect might not be able to discern amongst it. Based upon these compounding infinitum variations of the threat, it becomes exponentially too difficult in order to know how to survive as an alternative, which is the function of it as a hate group engaging in the systems of war, exhausting to death its civilian targets until it collapses into its communist ideals and the various gimmicks derived by the false reports that do not include the most important aspects of the details, communicates the defamation record for the anarcho communities and extra law of the children of Satan, the progenitors of perdition. Now, under the Hegelian dialectic, or as above, so below, generating the position that they, through their magic illusions hypercompounded by their secrecy, generates the capability for the capture of each particular party in substantive change of the narrative, as they cause the problem by which they seek to solve, and any challenger to their solution becomes an enemy combatant, and thus is mislabeled under any number of various distractions. And thus the qualifier of a real solution, instead of the continuation of the scams, would be the most viable answer in a good faith conversation, which must be drowned out by loud noises and aggression by the malicious subverters who, not having an argument, generate exponential emotion or other illusionary distractions for persuasion in favor of their unearned gains derivative of that scam. which is the normal function of the development of blackmail, which has been normalized in the FBI and others as techniques for control by influence from the compromised parties, which evolves into I believe it's called the silver money, I think. I forget exactly the exact history on it, but basically the silver would actively be used in the blackmail in order to stop people from being raided as a functional tribute, which would be normalized to this position so that they, not being traumatized by the hate group raids, would systemically have to have paid for the luxuries of peace in the society, which is altogether different than law enforcement, as the function of law enforcement is enforcement of the laws. Any violators are arrested, as opposed to this position of Confederate slave raiders or Confederates on patrol, which generate the pretense towards the Fugitive Slave Act exponentially expanding the function that each jurisdiction pay this tribute of silver in order to prevent the consequences, actively derivative, generating their own power of the purse for an infinite money glitch by the extortion in order to stop the abuses. And according to some estimates, they have conducted captures of individuals charging around $10,000 a month in order to prevent that type of abuse, which exponentially creates compromising positions under the various conditions of those contracts and orders for other parties, because the entry of that investment naturally, by its very core essence, derives the obligation to engage in necessary precautions in order to stop it, which would only trigger the war criminals, especially amongst the undisciplined militia of the white trash, who, being compounded in their normal terror operations, are an insatiable harassment group who, having trained themselves from youth under the Hitler's Youth variant programs, have normalized themselves towards the bully culture as the childish behavior has prevented them from growing up. They then become adult children in these abuse rackets, infinitely deriving their nonsensical harassments as a sense of entertainment, which is traumatizing the general public, requiring the act of labeling them appropriately as the terrorists and their other violations so that the laws might be enforced equally. Now, the Constitution states that everyone is to receive equal justice under the law despite status or office, which is actively targeted to be undermined, as Confederates are by no means American and are actively adversaries to the Constitution and its capacity to form a government, such as through the voting system, which is traumatized by these terrorist operations, requiring the voter fraud as a form of blackmail. In order to engage in the non abuse, they must comply with having sold the birthright of those advantages, as the corruption slowly dissolves the entirety of the system into non-existence, and thus conformity with the neo-slavery inherent to the plantation society. An important thing to understand in some subversions of secret society cults, such as the example of the Saatian Jews, which would actively seek to subvert Jews as a society, engage in the functional attack on it, and thus support the Kabbalah's activities to engage in the magic subversions, which then materialize the function of the ritual sacrifices, which not only incorporate themselves into the local cultures but also into their studies abroad and historically, such as the engrossment into the sacrifice rituals of the Canaanites and the worship of their gods, and thus are fundamentally opposed as Philistines against the cultural Jews who would engage in the normal function of accepted society. And thus these subversive positions generate their various published identities as collective groups engaging in the use of fraud, and that fraud is hyper reliant upon their agreements to secrecy, which allows for the mass censorship as to prevent the development of the thought so that all parties who are under their control might not understand in the least what they are up to. And to the ends that they do this, they are unopposed in their ritual capabilities of the mass sacrifices, such as the creation of the Holocaust, which in their records, from the secret records that I've observed, they would have actively played a part into the manipulation, as Hitler wanted the Jews to leave and did not want to kill them, but was compelled by his secret agreements, such as the funding derived by Wall Street in the United States, which was underneath their control. And this being an extension of what Hitler claimed to be a Jewish bank conspiracy, would then actively infuse the position of these mass bank fraud schemes in order to have fake Jews actively incorporate the mass arrangements for these mass murder rituals, for the hyper empowerment, generating the superiority of the anti Semitic over the Jews, and thus the complete and permanent opposition to all Semites across the world, not just the Jewish variety, and thus their position hyper endorsing the construct from the Confederate white supremacists in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion were happy to imbue themselves and attune to its arrangements that it might be matured under that construct, so that they may continue these systems, deriving their alternative sacrifice system for the sin eaters, for the human sacrifices, and for the manufacture of the mass ritual murders necessary to their secret magics. Those groups and their tentacles actively seek the reproduction of chaos for the materialization of the prophecies, as the means justify the ends of creating the means, normalizes the criminal market in order to manufacture their beliefs in the creation by their own hands, the materialization of the prophecies in Revelation, creating the mass destruction of the world, as those labeled in Revelation as uh, the men that destroyed the world would be punished for their crimes against it, and thus the manufacture for the compulsion, the strong arming of God in order to make revelation as a system of ritualistic spells generates the core goal of the position. Now, if you believe in the position of that arrangement, then you understand that it is a worldwide human genocide, and thus, in this action, has ended as a conspiracy against all nations, which have been targeted for uprooting to be eradicated under these various systems, which is an act of treason which requires the incompetent compliance of each of its governments, which have to systemically commit treason against themselves in their devotion to their own deaths derived by their psychopathy, such as the support of these witchcraft networks, generating the traumatizing effects against their communities uh, for their sliver of cash, which is then hyperinflated and destroyed by virtue of the destruction of the system that they have sold, and thus the mechanism of their superior profits are intrinsically attached to the thing that they are destroying without the capacity of exiting, generating their obligation to make the transfer into the one world government, completing the systems of revelation, and its compounding strong delusion. The systems of those insurgencies have dismantled the mechanisms of law and the security derivative of those activities, and thus the function having collapsed from the usurpation by sedition has evolved or morphed or degenerated all of the legal precedents which protect each of the function until each thing by clever devices means in function its opposite by the delusional enforced by the spells by the Confederacy, which having engaged in that function through its multiple vessels from the fracturing, generate the mechanisms which free each essential aspect from its core loyalty. Take, for instance, the function of contractors for military operations. The blueprints derivative of the equipment being generated, which creates the superiority of the United States military, is not owned by the United States. It is owned by the company, which can at any time and will, on the trigger, when given the proper signal, betray the United States and use all of that equipment against the United States, sold to its various adversaries in the function of having conquered it, and to that extent generate the highest threat to national security in American history. And this having systemically been supported by many double agents taking the deal with the devil, such as the Confederates who have acquired positions in Congress by voter fraud, accepting exponential deals and under behind closed doors arrangements to take portions of the profits derivative from the lobbyist laundering structures, would then sell out the United States by the systems of insurrection, allowing on purpose for those vulnerabilities to exist so that they, on maturity, might transfer out of the United States for the planned breach of law at the larger catastrophic level, leaving the Americans who have been paying their taxes and devoting all of their loyalties to America completely vulnerable to the insurrection as all of the security devolves into the background and being completely evaporated by the disloyal generates the exponential obligation for the Second Amendment as a desperate level in order to survive.